The Imperial Russian Navy and their Soviet successors, despite all their shortcomings, certainly had some very interesting and odd-looking ships and/or ideas, especially when it came to their battle line. The ideas for these Russian battleships range from more conventional battleships like these to something more out there like this design with 84 underwater torpedo tubes. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the strangest Russian battleships and/or designs. In the future, I hope to cover more general Russian and Soviet ships, but I simply don't have the sources. Anyway, let's get into the video. Starting with possibly the strangest one on our list today, the Russian Torpedo Battleship. Following the Russo-Japanese War, the Imperial Russian Navy was significantly weakened, leading to some very interesting ideas to try to compensate for the lack of big gun battleships in the Russian battle line. One such idea comes from the mind of a young naval designer, one Pavel Viktorovich Iankov. Being a graduate of the Naval Engineering School at Kronstadt in 1910, he began working as a designer first at the Baltic Works and then at the naval base at what today is Tallinn. Although the torpedo had performed somewhat lacklusterly during the Russo-Japanese War, recent advancements in the 1910s gave the weapon similar ranges to what was believed at the time to be effective gun range, i.e. about 6,000 meters or 6,500 yards, leading to some students of naval warfare to believe that the use of torpedoes in conjunction with the battle fleet could lead to success during the battle. Torpedo boats had already been in use in the Imperial Russian Navy, but Iankov was thinking bigger, better, and more innovative. Following along the lines of other naval designers in the United States or Germany, Iankov thought of the torpedo battleship. It's just that his was a bit more eccentric, being armed with 84 underwater torpedo tubes, and many other novel and interesting features. Before we continue, I should say that this section isn't going to be the most visually stimulating, as the design never got off of paper, so it's hard to find photos, so forgive me if I use photos of other period Russian ships. The one thing I do have is the final design, as found in Stephen McLaughlin's Russian and Soviet battleships, which I'll be sure to show for a long duration of this section. Now, to understand the design of this torpedo battleship, we need to understand what it was intended to do. Where we turn to McLaughlin as he writes, Iankov and other advocates of the torpedo battleship did not see the type as an alternative to heavily gunned battleships, rather it was meant to complement the more traditional battle fleet. The basic conception was that the torpedo battleship would break from the line some point during or immediately before the main gunnery action, close with the enemy at high speed, brush past his screening forces, and launch a massive salvo of torpedoes. These torpedoes would probably damage several enemy battleships, throwing his line into chaos, thus giving a decisive advantage to the big gun battleships that would finish the work of destruction. It was argued that the mere threat of such a torpedo attack would force the enemy into evasive maneuvering that would disrupt his line, throw off his fire control, and cause him to lose the initiative. So with that being said, Iankov, as I mentioned, started as a designer at the Baltic Works in St. Petersburg, and then was sent to the naval base at Revel, today what is the capital of Estonia, Tallinn. There, he began sketching his first ideas of his torpedo battleship, a 15,000-ton design with about 12 130mm guns and a few 47mm guns, and no fewer than 64 broadside-mounted underwater torpedo tubes. This very vague sketch appeared to show a ram-bowed warship, with a flush deck hull with a little above the upper decks, besides the conning tower well forward, and two very widely spread funnels. Some boats, masts, and other fittings were shown, but no details of the machinery was provided or the arrangement of the torpedoes. This initial sketch provided ideas for a much more detailed second sketch, which on a 22,000-ton displacement was armed with 84 underwater torpedo tubes, most likely 42 per side, and with the torpedoes either being the 450mm variant or the 533mm variant. 10 178mm guns and turrets, and 28 twin 130mm guns and casemates. With the artillery being so light, it meant that the ship could have very hefty armor, a belt of 406mm. For comparison, a contemporary battleship like the Queen Elizabeth's, as they were part of the 1913 estimates, when the torpedo battleship design was being experimented with, the Queen Elizabeth's had a main belt at their thickest point of about 356mm. The torpedo battleship would also have a 102mm deck. The reason for this thickness was because of how close the ship would have to close with the enemy forces to effectively get off its torpedoes and sow chaos in the enemy line, around 2,000 to 3,000 meters. This also meant that the ship needed to be fast, really fast. Therefore, Iankov called for the ship to have machinery for 78,000 shaft horsepower on 4 shafts and a top speed of 30 knots. Again, comparing it to Royal Navy ships, contemporary Royal Navy destroyers of the Acosta class had a top speed of 29 knots. Another interesting feature is the ship could also be a high-capacity mine layer with the ability to carry about 700 mines. Iankov submitted the design to the staff of the naval forces of the Baltic Sea sometime in December 1912. In the following February, the fleet commander, Vice Admiral Essen, sent the designs to the Naval Ministry as he felt they deserved special consideration. He wanted to give Iankov an opportunity to develop his ideas more fully. Essen's enthusiasm stemmed from the fact that he was an aggressive commander and had under his command a battle line of 4 pre-dreadnoughts and 4 dreadnoughts under construction. Not exactly a match for his most likely opponent in the German High Seas Fleet if they decided to move on the Baltic in force. With Yankov's torpedo battleships, he hoped to generate chaos in the German line and hopefully allow a substantially smaller force to eke out a victory. In June, Essen wrote the Naval General Staff saying, "As one of the auxiliary forces for the squadron, i.e. the battle line, while by no means insisting on the construction of a torpedo ship based off Lieutenant Yankov's design, I ask that the development of the design for a similar torpedo ship be undertaken by the GUK, Department of Ship Construction, immediately, so that 2 such ships can be included in the next year's shipbuilding program, replacing a division of torpedo boats." Essen's willingness to sacrifice a division of destroyers, still called torpedo boats in the Imperial Navy, showed his belief that such a torpedo battleship might survive long enough to release a devastating strike on the enemy line. Yankov's final design in 1913 was a ship with a displacement of 23,000 tons, an armament of 84 450mm underwater torpedo tubes split evenly on either side, 12 178mm guns and triple turrets along the center line of the ship, a main belt of 400mm reducing to 150mm fore and aft, longitudinal bulkheads of 50mm, transverse bulkheads of 300mm, barbettes of 125mm to 75mm, a conning tower with a maximum thickness of 450mm, and decks of up to 75mm thick depending on the area. The armor was to be Klopf steel from Germany. The machinery was to consist of 15 oil-burning Yarrow small tube boilers that gave steam to 4 Parsons turbines that drove 2 shafts, giving around 72,000 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 28 knots. Interestingly enough, the artillery section of the GUK generally supported the torpedo battleship concept, with their request being that the guns be changed to something more standard, like 152mm or 203mm guns, and some minor armor changes. However, the Naval General Staff wasn't interested at first, saying that it was impractical. Then, in November 1913, they agreed to use it in tactical games to test the type, with the results being inconclusive, as the enemy decided to decline a naval engagement, turning away as the torpedo battleships closed. Given that the Russians were at a severe numerical disadvantage, it wasn't exactly the worst account for them, giving some hope for those who were pushing the torpedo battleship concept, giving Iankov the go-ahead for the final design we just discussed. They followed up by conducting a tactical study of the prospects of the torpedo battleship and determined that it could be useful in the line of battle and a very effective addition. However, the design was ultimately rejected in 1914. Why, you might ask? Well, it goes back to the reason why Vice Admiral Essen wanted them in the first place: their severe numerical disadvantage. The General Naval Staff felt to effectively use such a vessel, Russia would need to possess a large battle fleet, something they did not have, and therefore, the design should be shelved for further consideration down the line when the Baltic Fleet had more than the Ganget-class dreadnoughts, which, as we know, was something that would never happen, and the design was shelved permanently. Next on our list is a more conventional battleship, although not as well known as their Baltic cousins, the Empress Maria class. With their triple turrets along the center line of the ship, they are uniquely Russian. In January 1910, There were reports from the Russian naval attachés in London and Constantinople that reported the Ottoman Empire was ordering dreadnoughts from the United Kingdom, this being the Reshidio or the eventual HMS Aran and a possible sister ship. Although these rumors and reports from the attachés were premature, the threat of a rearming Ottoman Empire to Russia was something that was intolerable to the government. Although the Naval Ministry had no intentions of building new battleships for the Black Sea Fleet, there was nothing the Naval Ministry could do to change the government's mind, and essentially, against their will, they were forced to look into designs for Black Sea dreadnought battleships. The Naval General Staff proposed a set of characteristics, the first being speed. Speed was not as important as compared to the Sevastopol class because these new ships were confined to the Black Sea. A top speed of 20.5 up to 21 knots instead of the 23 was perfectly fine. It meant that they could devote more resources to heavier guns or armor. Turret armor was increased to 250mm from the 200 on the Sevastopol class, and elevation of the guns was increased by 5 degrees. Different turret configurations were considered. However, the Naval General Staff decided they liked their unique, linear arrangements of the turrets, with all of them remaining on the centerline of the ship at the same level. There were improvements to the turrets, making them roomier for the crews. Alexander III in 1919, and it should be noted that when the British had the ex-Emperor Alexander III in 1919, they were extremely interested in the turrets as they wanted to use triple turrets on capital ships. The secondary battery was increased from 102mm to 130mm, or from 4 inches to 5.1 inches on casemates on either side of the ship due to the increasing size of destroyers. The design was handed over to the Duma or Parliament for approval. The 102 million ruble bill was approved and then signed into law in May 1910, which authorized the construction of 3 battleships, 9 destroyers, and 6 submarines for the Black Sea Fleet. Since we haven't discussed Russian ships all too much on the channel, something important to understand is that in Russia, especially in the imperial past, the design and construction phase gets a little weird. I mean, look at these circular monitors from the 1870s. And even between different ships of the same class, there can be some serious differences between them, because different decisions were made between the dockyards and the naval staff. In this case, the first radical and unique idea was from the chief inspector of shipbuilding, who thought that they should replace the machinery with diesels, a very forward-thinking idea. It was estimated that they would save 3,000 tons and allow 14-inch guns to be used on the battleships. The idea was eventually rejected as it was not practical, and debates continued at a somewhat leisurely pace. Remember, the Navy didn't want to do this anyway. In May 1911, before the bill approving the ships was signed, news about the Ottomans actually ordering the 2 dreadnoughts from British yards, armed with 13.5-inch guns, broke, and now it was finally time to panic. The Russians again got the date wrong, and the Ottomans did not order the ships until June, but still, they were being ordered, at least one of the proposed 2. Nevertheless, the Naval Ministry got kicked into gear as they feared the Ottomans would launch a preemptive strike as soon as their dreadnoughts were complete. The Ottoman ships were not just dreadnoughts, but super dreadnoughts, meaning they were larger and more powerfully armed than the first-generation dreadnoughts the Russians were building, so they began looking into upgunning the Empress Maria class. The Artillery Commission found that the difficulties of obtaining this armament, i.e. 14-inch guns, lay in the fact that the Obukovsky work is not in the position to provide the necessary number of 14-inch guns, 36 barrels, by the deadline stipulated by the MGSH for the completion of these vessels, the 1st of January 1915, and this will delay the completion of the vessels by 1.5 years. They then looked into purchasing guns from abroad, Armstrong, Vickers, Coventry, Klopp, Skoda, and Schneider, but the Naval General Staff concluded that the 12-inch guns of the class were more than sufficient to handle the 13.5-inch guns the Ottoman battleships carried. After some thought about transferring the Sevastopol class from the Baltic to the Black Sea and understanding its impracticality, the final design was set at 12-inch guns and a 21-knot top speed. Russian shipyards in the south of the country were chosen because few foreign firms wanted to take on the Russian ships. Many of the southern shipbuilding companies lacked experience and therefore relied on help from domestic and foreign shipbuilders like the Baltic shipbuilders and the British firm Vickers. Now, from reading up on Russian ship construction and the Navy as a whole, one gets the impression that the shipbuilding firms, naval staff, and the different fleets didn't get along too well. So in this competition, the first contract went to the Society of Nikolaev Works and Yards, or the Russian abbreviation ONZIV. And the new company, the Russian Shipbuilding Joint Stock Company, or RUSID, got the other contracts. The competition was pretty fierce from the different shipbuilders. Still, the new RUSID got the backing and financial support of the Imperial family, and so got the second bid along with help from the designers of the state-owned Baltic Works. These two were given preliminary orders in late August 1911. Once this was done, the two firms began working hard to complete designs, and throughout the autumn and winter of 1911, they competed with one another to get their ideas chosen. Unsurprisingly, the state-backed, more experienced RUSID/Baltic Works design won the competition, and the ships began being laid down in October 1911. There were provisions in the contracts for the 3 battleships to be made out of exclusively Russian material and equipment. This was quite ambitious, and so there was an escape clause to allow the firms building the ships to use outside help. RUSID used equipment from the British firm John Brown for some of the machinery. ONZIV used Vickers. Empress Maria was built in RUSID dockyards and was required that she and her sister Emperor Alexander III be complete by August 1915. She was 3 months late thanks to foreign help, which is pretty good all things considered. She was launched in October 1913 and had a displacement of 22,600 tons and an actual of 23,413. Her machinery consisted of 20 small tube boilers, giving steam to 4 turbines, with a design shaft horsepower of 26,000, and on trials, she had 33,200, giving her a real top speed of 21.5 knots. She had an armament of 12 12-inch or 305mm 52 caliber guns and 4 triple turrets along the center line of the ship, 25.1-inch or 130mm 55 caliber guns and casemates, and 4 underwater torpedo tubes. As for armor, she had a main belt of 262.5mm or 10.3 inches thick, which thinned out as it went forward and aft to 125mm or 4.9 inches, with bulkheads of 50mm or 2 inches thick, turrets with a face thickness of 250mm or 9.84 inches, sides and roofs of 125mm or 4.9 inches, barbettes of 250mm or 9.8 inches, and 125mm or 4.9 inches behind the upper belt. A conning tower with a maximum thickness of 300mm or 11.81 inches, and decks with a maximum thickness of 37mm or 1.46 inches. The construction of the ships went relatively quickly, considering the outbreak of the Great War in July 1914, which did hamper some of Empress Maria's sisters, as they could not get the material needed due to the war. It was also because of the war that the speed of the construction was increased, and some of the equipment intended for her sisters was given to her. Upon her completion, she began running trials in August 1915, which revealed some defects to the lubrication system of the starboard low-pressure turbine, but were otherwise satisfactory. It was also found that she trimmed badly by the bow. This meant that it hampered the secondary battery and, more critically, the handling of the ship. So reductions in the amount of ammunition carried by the 2 forward turrets and casemates, along with the shortening of the starboard anchor, helped somewhat. Throughout her career, she had many minor modifications aimed at improving the design and construction of the ship, like the removal of the paravane-like minesweeping equipment at the boom of the bow, which proved ineffective, or the addition of 75mm guns to the roofs of the turrets. The 3 battleships went on to have some odd and eventful careers, with the most notable being the Empress Maria. She assisted in Russian advances around the Black Sea, and having the captain of the German cruiser Breslau tell her to kiss his ass. More details in my video on the Empress Maria. And eventually on October 20th, 1916, she was destroyed by internal explosions in the forward magazine while moored in Sevastopol harbor, killing 227 men in the explosion and her eventual sinking. The wreck was partially raised in November 1917 and fully raised in May 1918. Where she was taken into dock with little work carried out and eventually scrapped in 1926. Her sister ship, Emperor Alexander III, renamed Liberty in April 1917, also had an interesting career, where in 1917, after fleeing the German advance on Sevastopol, was ordered to return to the city when she was taken over by the Germans and renamed Volga. She was considered for use by the Germans, and they tested the ship, but her guns were inoperable, so nothing much came of it. She was next handed over to the French and British forces after the German withdrawal in November 1918, and turned over to the White Russian forces and renamed General Alexiev, operating with these forces until 1920, where after the withdrawal of Allied forces from the area, she was handed over to the French. There was some discussion about the French handing the vessel back over to the Soviets, but it fell through, and the ship was scrapped in 1936. Finally, the Empress Catherine II, or the Empress Catherine the Great, began her life in 1915, where her claim to fame is that she engaged the German battlecruiser Goeben, but the German ship escaped due to her superior speed. In April 1917, she was renamed Free Russia, and beyond that didn't do much, besides flee with her sister ship Emperor Alexander III to avoid the German advance on Sevastopol, and unlike her sister ship, her crew elected to scuttle the battleship instead of returning. Last, we have a British battleship, the Royal Sovereign, and I know what you're thinking, but just let me explain. To give some background details, the ship was completed in May 1916, displacing some 30,000 tons and 18 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, giving steam to Parsons turbines, producing 43,000 shaft horsepower and a top speed of about 22 knots. She was armed with 8 15-inch 42 caliber guns and twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft, and 14 6-inch 45 caliber guns and casemates, 2 3-inch AA guns, 4 3-pounders, 5 machine guns, 10 Lewis guns, and 4 underwater torpedo tubes. As for her armor, the main thing I will note is that unlike the Queen Elizabeth class, the R class had a uniform main belt of 13 inches and did not reduce to 8 inches below the waterline. There were some other modifications, but overall, they were almost identical to the QEs. She didn't do much during the First World War and interwar periods, as she was held back in port at Jutland and didn't have the same extensive modifications as the QEs did, which by the time the Second World War kicked off in September 1939 made the R-Class a less capable fighting unit than the modernized Queen Elizabeths. A great example of this is the Royal Sovereign at the Battle of Calabria, where Admiral Andrew Cunningham, although with other hindrances, one of his chief ones was that his speed was limited by the Royal Sovereign. It had nothing to do with their crew, as their problem was the fact that they could barely get 20 knots out of the ship, and by this point, her sister Ramillies couldn't even exceed that if she wanted to. With that being said, she continued to serve mainly on escort duty in the North Atlantic after this, and spent some time with the Eastern Fleet for convoy duty in the Indian Ocean, going to Philadelphia Dockyard for a refit between 1942 and October 1943, where her light anti-aircraft battery was greatly augmented. Due to manpower shortages, she was paid off and put into the reserve because there were more capable battleships in service. As I have stated in previous videos, it was no secret that Joseph Stalin longed for a modern navy with the Soviet buildup of their battleships, the modernization of the Gangets, and the buildup of destroyer and cruiser forces, some of them coming from Italian yards, and hopefully now from the defeated Regia Marina. Stalin hoped to secure one of their modern battleships of the Littorio class, which wouldn't happen, but discussions for the Soviets to receive a battleship continued. Thus, with the upgrades to the Royal Sovereign in mind, and her being in the reserve, when the question arose of temporarily transferring ships to the Soviet Union instead of the immediate delivery of a portion of the Italian fleet, as it was not practical with the war continuing and Italian co-belligerency, the Royal Sovereign was in good enough shape and available. After negotiations, it was agreed that the Royal Navy would loan Royal Sovereign 9 destroyers and 4 submarines. On May 30th, 1944, the Soviet flag was raised on Royal Sovereign in Newcastle. Royal Sovereign became the Archangel, named for the port city, and I won't even try the Russian pronunciation as it just comes out as a jumbled mess. Like a lot of ships in Soviet service, it's incredibly hard to get details about her service with the Soviet Navy, and I'll detail what little there is. One of the more interesting facts is that her crew was mostly comprised of former crew members of the battleship Petropavlovsk, the ex-Jean-Paul Marat, and if you don't know that name, give it a Google, he's quite the character. Anyway, the ship was added to the Soviet Navy list on May 9th, 1944, even before she was officially transferred. It was some time before she was worked up with her new crew, departing Scapa Flow as part of convoy JW-59 in early August 1944. Probably for the best, because by this point, the elderly battleship could only make 19 knots because her machinery needed a rather large and expensive overhaul. During which operation, it was attacked by the U-boat U-711, but the torpedoes would detonate short of their target. Not the last time German submarines threatened the ship. Arriving at the Soviet port of Vianga on the 24th of August. The ship rotated between there, Murmansk, or Polyarny for the remainder of the war. In September and early October, several attacks by the U-boats U-315 and U-313 were thwarted by net defenses while the ship was moored near Murmansk. Another attack was halted because of mechanical failures, this time by 6 German midget submarines. After the German surrender, the Archangel made several cruises in the Barents and White Seas, running aground in the fall of 1947 in the White Sea Inlet. All the while back in the United Kingdom, there were calls to have the ship returned, notably by Winston Churchill, who, when he loaned the ship, the irony of the Royal Sovereign going to the Soviet Union was not lost on him. There were several attempts to get the battleship returned to the United Kingdom, with Stalin basically hoping the British would forget about it and he could keep it. The Prime Minister said, "I can see no reason why we, in return for such help to Russia and Italy, should leave our ships in Russian hands. We are entitled to get those ships back, and the scrap would be extremely useful to us at the present moment." The Admiralty saw no value in ships like the Royal Sovereign, especially considering the fact she hadn't received any major work while in Russian hands the past 4 years, and when they did hand her over, she wasn't exactly in the best condition. Still, after more hemming and hawing by the Soviets, she was returned in 1949 when the Soviets received their portion of the Italian fleet and received the Italian dreadnought Giulio Cesare. Royal Sovereign returned to the United Kingdom in what can only be described as an awful state, with reports detailing her being covered in rust, live rounds loaded in the guns, and some even rusted in place. Unsurprisingly, the ship was placed on the disposal list almost immediately and was sent to be scrapped a short time later. Some rather odd and unique warships here. I'm already compiling a list of further Russian and Soviet warships to do. In the next installment, I plan on covering those infamous circular monitors. Let me know what you thought about these warships down below, and any suggestions you might have for a future video. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.